Well, this hour, 100 years ago, the great powers of Europe were in the first moments of war. A war that would take millions of lives, reshape borders, and set the stage for a century of conflict and upheaval that arguably still goes on today. In a moment, two keen observers of what the First World War meant then and still does today. The acclaimed Canadian author, Margaret Macmillan, whose latest book, The War That Ended Peace, is provocative beyond just the title. And Monk School Senior Fellow and the CBC's former senior correspondent, Brian Stewart. Their thoughts in a moment, but first, some basic reminders. When the guns of August first roared a century ago this week, many on both sides thought they'd be silent quickly, maybe even by that Christmas. They weren't. The war would drag on for more than 4 years, with brutal and enormous costs, not the least of which 16 million soldiers and civilians dead. Initially, it was a European war, one that saw a chain reaction unfold. Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia. Russia got in to back Serbia. Germany came in against Russia. France got in against Germany. Britain then backed France. And on it went as it became truly the First World War, with nations from around the globe involved, Canada included. In fact, more than 60,000 Canadians died. Think about that for a moment. On average, more than 40 dead Canadians each day of the conflict. For context, in Afghanistan, we lost 158 Canadians in 10 years of combat. When what they called the Great War finally ended, there was great hope it would never be repeated. But the days that followed made that hope a hollow one. Why had there been a war? What did it accomplish? And are we really still living through the reverberations of what started 100 years ago this week? All good questions. Time for some answers. All right, well, let me concede right off the bat. I didn't explain why there was a war. As a good student, we all remember the Archduke's assassination in Sarajevo. It was clearly the spark plug, but what was the underlying reason there was this conflict, Margaret?
Well, there were lots of underlying reasons. There were national tensions, national rivalries, economic rivalries, fights over colonies, fears of others, fears of the Slavic hordes coming towards Germany or fears of the Germans coming towards France. I think it was a very tense continent, but there were also a lot of people who wanted peace. And I think without the accident of the Archduke getting assassinated, we might have escaped that war.
Ryan, you see it that way?
I do very much. I think it was also the tempo and timing of the crisis itself. We're used to crises before, wars breaking out, lasting 6, 9 months. This was barely 5 weeks of muddled, hurried, non-transparent diplomacy. It was people misunderstanding the alliance they were in, fearing the alliance would fall apart if they didn't support it. It was it was one of the great examples to the world, I think, of just how not to handle a crisis.
And the decisions being made by a relatively small group of people.
Yes. I think you'd put them into a school bus, probably, or if that would be generous number of seats left over.
And then they'd all fight each other on the school bus. No, it was a very small, well, it came down to a very small number of people because there were a few people who had to make the decisions to sign the documents that led to mobilization and war or could have refused. And I think what we saw in those 5 weeks was a real failure of civilian leadership in both Germany and Russia and in the Austrian Empire. You've got the civilians giving way to the soldiers who said, we have to fight now. And I think it's a very good lesson that you have to keep in control of the military.
Another thing I think was a failure of imagination. Now, some generals, more than we think, saw a long war, a terrible long war lasting 3 years or even more. But civilian leaders did not, and the civilians themselves did not. They could not imagine a war lasting as long as it did. It might last 6 months. It would be a horrible thing, but it would be out of their system once they got through it. They couldn't see what we can now see.
You know, it's been called a seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. There were a lot of catastrophes in the 20th century. Was it really the seminal catastrophe?
I think it was, because really out of that war grew fascism, Nazism, communism. I think it didn't necessarily lead right to the Second World War, but it certainly set up all the conditions for the Second World War. And of course, from that further catastrophe, all the problems we have today in many ways.
Margaret?
Yeah, the 20th century is a dreadful century in world history, and particularly dreadful for Europe. And I think what the First World War did is destroy a lot of the order which had held the world together, destroy a lot of the civility, destroy the ways in which they had managed to deal with crises before. And I think I agree completely with Brian. It created conditions for many other changes. It also hastened the decline of Europe. It hastened the disappearance of the great European empires, which, for better or worse, had been very much a part of the world scene. It hastened the rise of the United States. And I think we're still, of course, living with many of the borders that were set at the end of the First World War and at the end of the Second World War. So it is a huge part of our history.
Many of the borders that were set and many of the problems that were set at the time as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happened, I think, or was happening anyway, but the First World War speeded it up, was we got the idea that states should be based on an ethnicity, which is asking for trouble because human populations are so mixed up that it's very difficult to say this is all Czech, this is all German, or this is all Shia, or this is all Sunni, as you're getting in Iraq today. And so it led to this dreadful war of peoples against people who'd often been neighbors before.
Well, when I was a foreign correspondent covering wars, I was always struck by, or usually struck by, the fact that when I went into the history of it, it all started tracing itself back to the First World War, obviously before that. But the big culprit seemed to be the First World War time after time.
Yeah.
You know, you said to me the other day that there's this kind of lingering sadness that exists because of what happened during the First World War. What did you mean by that? Well,
it's hard to put it in terms, but there is almost a kind of tragic romanticism to the sheer tragedy of it. I mean, there was the art, the poetry, but overall, I think this feeling that it should not have happened. It need not have happened. The world might have been spared unbelievable amounts of catastrophes if people had done things differently and taken different decisions, which you point out in your book. But beyond that, there is something about that war where the best wishes of a lot of people sort of died. I mean, in those cemeteries, you cannot look at those cemeteries without choking up sometimes.
How does it make that war different from others then?
I think the other thing about the First World War is that it didn't seem to settle things. I mean, if you look at the Napoleonic Wars, they lasted a very long time. They resulted in as many deaths in comparison to the populations as the First World War did. But at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, with the Battle of Waterloo, it was over, it was done with. Europe had a long period of peace. And I think we look back at the First World War and we think they put all that effort in, they lost all those lives, and what did they end up with? An imperfect peace, which, as Brian said, helped to create the conditions which led to the Second World War. So I think with the First World War, we have this sense that it wasn't worth it all.
Yeah, it was that sort of, and also the youth of the innocents who died in that war. They went on to call it sort of the lost generation after that war. It sort of gnawed its way into our philosophy, our religion, our arts. Everything was infected by that sense of a tragic loss and a lost generation, and maybe a lost world for a while.
You know, I was just back at Vimy Ridge in the last few weeks, went back with my son. We also toured a number of cemeteries outside of the Vimy area. There's so many spots within, 45 minutes or an hour of Vimy that are Canadian cemeteries, and there are thousands of young Canadians who were buried there. What struck me, apart from the staggering silence that you find in so many of those spots and the overwhelming nature of the Vimy monument, was the number of other Canadians who were there. Overall at Vimy this year, there'll be 700,000 visitors. Now, most of those are British and French, but there'll also be thousands of Canadians. Why do you think it is that still, a century later, 100 years later, people are going back?
I'm finding it curious because the commemoration of the First World War has been growing rather than getting less, and you would think it would be the other way around. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, they were thinking of cancelling the big Remembrance Day services because so few people were turning up, and now it seems huge. I think it's partly because we've ourselves in North America have lived through a long period of peace, and in Europe as well. And so we're fascinated in an appalled and horrified way by something that drew in what were very progressive and advanced and prosperous societies, and perhaps that sense that even societies which are very apparently stable, prosperous, can do something ghastly like that is something that scares us. And I think it was such a large catastrophe. I think there's a sense of awe. But I do find it absolutely fascinating. I'm not sure I got a clear answer on why it's now becoming such a huge commemoration.
You know, we watched a similar kind of thing happen with the Normandy memories and
20 years ago, we thought it would fade down.
Right.
In fact, it was extraordinary.
But at least some of those vets are still alive and very evident within our society. But
I think part of it, too, is more and more people are interested in their ancestors. And thanks to the computer, they're able to go back, and almost everybody is finding a great uncle or somebody who fought in the First World War. And remember, so many nationalities, including Indian, Pakistan, around the world, having the same sensation of people who were involved in this war. I think that's part of it, too. And I think the French have taken on a real interest, more than they were showing perhaps 30 or 40 years ago, in the other nations that served on their soil and died on their soil.
Why do you think that is?
Not sure. I wish I could understand it.
I think it sometimes is a reflection of present-day preoccupations. I mean, the British are very much engaged in commemorating the First World War, and I think that's partly because they're also engaged in wondering who they are. They're worried about immigration, they're worried about what it is to be British. Scotland may be separating, they're worried about their relationship with Europe. And I think they look back to the First World War as a time when Britain seemed to know what it was about, seemed to have a clear purpose, and of course was very important. And so I think there's an element of nostalgia in all this. Right. I mean, the Russians aren't nearly as interested in the First World War as other European countries. I mean, for them, it's the great patriotic war as the Second World War.
I think Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, too, have that sort of positive image looking back, that that's where they found their real sense of independence, or at least their own national personality. And I think that has a national effect in a lot of countries.
There aren't any kind of major Canadian commemoration services taking place in terms of government-sponsored ones over these next few days and weeks. You'll both be involved in one tomorrow night here in Toronto, a sunset ceremony, which is what, sold out, 6,000
It looks like it's sold out now at Varsity Stadium, though people can still, I think, peep over the fences. Yeah.
But a difference there between the people and governments in terms of wanting to organize something.
It's very curious, and I don't quite understand. I mean, the War Museum is doing something, but it's nothing on the scale that is being done in Australia or in France or in Belgium or in the United Kingdom. I mean, in Britain, they're doing huge amounts of things, and I don't quite understand it.
Spending large monies involving the whole country in a candlelight ceremony on the 4th. In France, on July 14th, of Bastille Day, France invited 80 countries who had participated either as nations or as colonies to join them in the march up the Champs-Élysées. It was spine-chillingly moving. I mean, that's class. Why we're not doing something equivalent? It's not for me to criticize, but many historians have pointed to the fact that we could be doing more to celebrate one of the most historic hours of our nation.
Well, it makes what you're going to witness tomorrow that more interesting and remarkable, because without all sort of the added attention of government sponsorship of events, you're looking at 6,000 people who are possibly going to be here for that sunset.
Organized largely by the University of Toronto and schools there, the Monk and the
It's obviously meeting a need, too. The fact that 6,000 people in the middle of summer in Toronto want to come out to a ceremony at Varsity Stadium is to me, absolutely extraordinary.
It frankly astounds me. If somebody told me 3 months ago you might get a full Varsity Stadium for a sunset ceremony to mark the last hours of peace in the old world, I would say maybe 2,000 if we're really lucky, but wow, this is amazing.
I like your idea that it may have something to do with this desire to look back and the ability through computers to be able to look back. The various ancestry locations that you can find on the web.
My 20-year-old daughter can know more about the First World War with one day on computer than it would take me in the old days. 3 weeks of going through the battles. It's amazing.
No, well, in Britain, they now have an app where you can be standing in a street and you can ask who from that street went into the First World War, from which house, and get the names. I mean, it's quite amazing.
Right.
That's remarkable.
We have a Canadian, R.H. Thompson. I think he's collecting every single name of every soldier killed in that war. That's astounding.
We got to take a short break, but I want to come back and conclude our discussion with some sense from each of you, both students of that time, of what struck you the most in your studies about the First World War. So we'll be back right after this. Welcome back on this, the 100th anniversary of the First World War. Back with our discussion with Brian Stewart and Margaret McMillan. You know, you've both spent a considerable amount of time through your careers studying the events of those 4 or 5 years. When you think back to what you learned, what you witnessed, what you've heard, what strikes you most about that time? Margaret.
I think what strikes me is that Europe didn't have to go to war. We tend to think it was bound to happen because there were so many possible causes, but there was a very strong will for peace and a very strong peace movement. And I think in the end, yes, there were tensions, but I think Europe went to war because of accident. I think if the Archduke's driver had not taken the wrong turning in Sarajevo, if one of the assassins had not wandered along to see what was happening and had been there with a gun, the car was stopped in front of him and he shot them, Austria-Hungary wouldn't have had the opportunity it needed to go to war with Serbia. And so I think there was a lot of accident. And I think if they could have dodged that crisis, they dodged earlier ones, they might have sailed on into 1915 with a peaceful Europe.
How different would the world be today if that had happened?
Very different. I mean, we wouldn't have a European Union. I think we'd have a different sort of Europe. We'd probably still have a strong United States, but who knows? China might have been divided up among one European empire or another. I think the world would have looked very different.
Brian?
I think it's the ability of people strangely to change their views. Before the war, right up to the last days, they're not really expecting a world war. They certainly don't seem to want one. After the war begins, they begin to buy into their own nations, feeling that it's on the defensive. It's fighting for its life in a defensive. And they not only buy into a war with remarkable solidity, but they then buy into a medium-length war and then a longer war, and it keeps going on for 4 years. You keep expecting, as you read the newspapers of the time, people to start saying, enough is enough. But they start to see it as a real fundamental, existential battle for survival of culture and virtue, values. And it's just awesome and frightening a little, and very disappointing and depressing when you watch that happen.
You know, when I look at those casualty figures for Canadians in the First World War, especially the numbers of dead, and you recognize that there are more than 40 a day on average, you wonder, aside from the conscription crisis, was there an outcry? Was there a, enough is enough, we got to get out of there?
There's a very good work by Jonathan Vance, a Canadian historian, called Death So Noble, where he studies how Canada absorbed the grief of the First World War. And he found, unlike Britain and some European countries, in Canada there really was a strong pride in the Canadian effort in that war. And there wasn't that aftermath bitterness and disillusionment in Canada about the First World War as there may have been in many European countries. So I don't think there was that, except for Quebec, of course, and certain agricultural areas, that desire to get out of it or that desire to demean it afterwards.
Margaret?
Well, one of the things that strikes me so much about the First World War as well is how long the societies held together. I mean, we look at the strains the war imposed and we realize that eventually the Russian Revolution was going to come, but it took 3 years for Russia to crumble and have a revolution. And what I think is extraordinary is how European societies stuck it out for that long. I mean, it seems to be one of those questions that historians should be doing more to explore. And in the case of Britain and France, they stuck it out till the end.
And many soldiers would say later in their memoirs, the people who suffered the most were the civilians, who had imagine 4 years of waiting maybe for the doorbell to ring and the telegraph boy to come with that awful telegraph, as so many had that moment. It was the dread of over 4 years, hard for us to even imagine.
All right. Well, listen, thank you both. Good luck tomorrow night.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And thank you as well for watching. We will have lots more on the First World War throughout the next few days on CBC.